My wife believed I lived modestly because I had no choice. She thought restraint was survival, not intention. What she never knew, what her family never bothered to imagine, was that I quietly controlled $10 billion tied to her father's empire, hidden behind structures old enough to be forgotten and patient enough to wait. I agreed to the family dinner for one reason only. I wanted to see how they treated a man they believed was small. Not poor in spirit, just irrelevant. Disposable. Temporary. The house sat above the city like a verdict already reached. Glass walls, cold stone. A view designed to remind you where you stood. Or where you didn't. I watched them speak around me, weigh me, reduce me. I let it happen. Some lessons require silence. Then the envelope slid across the table. Sealed, heavy, deliberate. In that moment, I understood the evening had never been a meal. It was a test. And it was over. 5 minutes later, nothing they believed about me, or themselves, was real anymore. Before I go on, let me ask you something personal. If you've ever been underestimated by the people closest to you, if you've ever carried more than anyone thought you had, stay with me. Subscribe, not for me, but because stories like this only matter if they're heard. And if you've lived something similar, share it in the comments. Silence is heavy. We don't have to carry it alone. The dinner was held at their hillside home outside Boulder, Colorado, a place designed to impress without warmth. Glass walls framed the city lights below like a private collection, something owned rather than admired. Stone floors carried every footstep too clearly, making silence feel intentional instead of accidental. Her father, Thomas Reed, sat at the center of the table as if the position had been engineered into the house itself. Everything radiated outward from him, his voice, his expectations, his version of reality. Elaine, my mother-in-law, sat to his right, composed and distant, her posture practiced in rooms where nothing is ever said by mistake. Our daughter, Maya, sat beside them, close enough to absorb their certainty without questioning it. Rachel and I were placed across the table. Not beside, across. A subtle geometry that required no explanation. We were positioned inward, as if observation was our purpose, not participation. The conversation flowed around me the way water moves around a stone. Real careers, real influence, people who built something that lasts. Expansion plans, regulatory victories, names dropped casually like currency everyone else already understood. No one asked for my opinion. No one needed it. When my work finally came up, it felt ceremonial, like an item on an agenda that had to be acknowledged before moving on. Consulting. Strategy. A polite nod followed by a smile that didn't quite reach Thomas's eyes. Someone remarked that it must be stressful living small, said gently, almost kindly, as if concern itself could soften the judgment. I noticed Rachel didn't correct them. Not because she agreed, but because she'd learned that resistance here only made things worse. Survival had taught her silence. I sat there listening, aware of how carefully I had been categorized. I wasn't a failure in their eyes. Failure would have required effort. I was something less dramatic, a temporary phase, a miscalculation that would eventually be corrected. The plates were cleared. Wine was refilled. The city lights shifted as clouds passed overhead, rearranging the view like a reminder that nothing below was fixed, even if they believed otherwise. That was when I understood something clearly and without anger. In their version of the family, I was already gone. Not divorced, not exiled, simply erased. Spoken about as if I were still present, but no longer relevant. A footnote that would eventually be edited out. I felt no urge to defend myself. No instinct to interrupt the narrative they had so confidently built. There is a certain calm that comes when you realize you're being judged by people who don't have the authority they think they do. I watched their faces, their habits, the way certainty made them careless. And I waited, because when people believe they are in control, they tend to reveal exactly how they plan to use it. Dessert arrived the way everything else had that night, carefully composed, expensive, and already decided. Small porcelain plates, sauces arranged with architectural precision, portions that suggested discipline rather than hunger. The kind of meal meant to signal control. Nothing excessive, nothing wasted, nothing accidental. Coffee followed. Then silence. Not the natural kind, the engineered kind, The pause that exists only because someone is waiting for the room to settle into the shape they want. Thomas Reed leaned back in his chair and reached beneath the table with the ease of a man retrieving something he'd rehearsed handling many times before. When his hand came back up, it held a thick envelope. Legal-grade paper, the kind that doesn't bend or wrinkle easily. It made a soft sound as he placed it on the stone surface between the coffee cups. Heavy, intentional, centered. He didn't look at Rachel. Not once. He didn't look at me either. The envelope spoke for him. It didn't need eye contact. Elaine adjusted her napkin. Maya lowered her eyes, studying the rim of her cup as if she were no longer certain she wanted to witness what came next. Rachel's posture stiffened beside me. Not in surprise, something deeper. Recognition. The body often understands betrayal before the mind gives it language. Thomas folded his hands. He explained it the way people explain things when they believe explanation is generosity. Calmly, reasonably, as if this were not a family matter but a logistical correction. He said they had been thinking for some time, that they believed clarity was kindness, that dragging things out only caused unnecessary damage, that everyone would be better off if this were handled cleanly. The envelope, he said, contained a separation agreement. He said it the way someone might say there was weather coming. No emotion, no hesitation. There was also a check. Not compensation, he clarified. Assistance. A bridge. A way for me to land on my feet without resentment or disruption. He emphasized those words, as though they had been carefully selected to sound humane. I didn't reach for the envelope. Rachel didn't either. The room held its breath, waiting for movement from one of us. Anger, denial, pleading. Something they could react to. Something familiar. What struck me most in that moment wasn't the document itself. It was the assumption behind it. The quiet confidence that this would be received as final. That my role here had already ended, and this was simply the administrative process of removal. Thomas spoke about efficiency, about not wanting to involve courts, about reputations, about avoiding ugliness. He never once used the word marriage. He spoke instead about alignment, compatibility, long-term vision. He framed the decision as inevitable, not chosen, as if the outcome had always existed and they were merely acknowledging it now. Elaine added a comment about how difficult this must be for Rachel, how much pressure she'd been under, how sometimes love isn't enough when realities don't match. She said it softly, sympathetically, like someone offering condolences at a distance. Rachel remained silent. Her hands were folded in her lap, knuckles pale, shoulders drawn inward. I could feel the tension radiating from her, the years of conditioning pressing down all at once. This wasn't just about me. It was about the expectation that she would comply, that she would accept their version of mercy. Maya finally looked up. Her expression was careful, composed. She had learned restraint early, learned when to speak and when not to. She didn't intervene. She didn't object. She observed. The envelope remained untouched. Thomas cleared his throat, perhaps unsettled by the absence of reaction. He slid the envelope a few inches closer, just enough to imply that the next move belonged to us. This isn't meant to be adversarial, he said. It's a solution. That word lingered in the air. Solution. As if I were the problem. I studied the envelope without opening it. The weight of it. The neatness. The confidence embedded in its thickness. This was not an impulsive act. This had been drafted, reviewed, revised. Discussed in rooms I had never been invited into. Possibly over meals very much like this one. I understood then that this dinner hadn't been about reconciliation or concern. It had been about documentation. About creating a moment they could later describe as civil, reasonable, mutually respectful. A narrative. And in that narrative I was already gone. I felt something settle inside me. Not anger, not fear. Something colder, clearer. The kind of focus that arrives when you finally see the shape of the board. I picked up the envelope, not to open it, just to acknowledge it. The paper was smooth under my fingers. Too smooth, manufactured for authority. I turned it once, then set it back down exactly where it had been. No one spoke. Thomas waited. Rachel inhaled sharply, then exhaled, as if bracing for the collapse she had been trained to expect. I didn't look at any of them, because in that moment, I realized something fundamental had shifted. They believed this was the end of a process. For me, it was the beginning of one. The room didn't move after the envelope was set down again. No one reached for coffee. No one shifted in their chair. The silence that followed wasn't awkward, it was evaluative. They were measuring the damage, recalculating, deciding whether the plan needed adjustment. Then our daughter spoke. Not impulsively, not emotionally, carefully. Maya's voice was calm, almost gentle. The way people speak when they believe kindness can soften a conclusion that's already been reached. She didn't look at me at first. She addressed the space between us, the idea of me rather than the person. She said Rachel could have had more. Not more love, more life, more opportunity, more exposure, more of what mattered. She said Rachel had always been capable of more, but that she had limited herself. That sometimes people shrink without realizing it, adjusting their expectations downward until the world feels smaller than it has to be. She paused before saying it, as if weighing whether honesty justified the cruelty. Then she said some people simply don't belong in bigger worlds. The words weren't sharp. That was what made them devastating. They were delivered without malice, without satisfaction. As if she were stating a fact everyone else had already accepted. I watched Rachel as Maya spoke. Her hands tightened in her lap, fingers curling into the fabric of her dress. A small, unconscious movement. Her shoulders dipped slightly, as though something heavy had settled there. Something familiar. This wasn't the first time Rachel had been told, implicitly or otherwise, that she had chosen down instead of forward. That she had settled. That loving me had been a compromise. But this was the first time it had been said out loud. At a table. With witnesses. With paperwork waiting nearby to formalize the correction. Elaine nodded slowly, as if this were a difficult but necessary truth. Thomas remained still, his expression neutral, satisfied in the way people are when the argument they didn't want to make has been made for them. I realized then that the envelope wasn't the real violation. Maya's words were, because documents can be contested, checks can be declined, legal strategies can be dismantled. But what she had done was redefine our marriage as a mistake that needed undoing. Not because it was unhealthy, not because it was broken, but because it didn't elevate her mother in the way the family had planned. Rachel had been framed as someone who had lost time, lost status, lost momentum, and I was the reason. I felt something tighten in my chest. Not anger, not defensiveness. A slow, deliberate narrowing of focus. The kind that comes when you realize the ground beneath you is no longer shared. Rachel didn't respond. She didn't interrupt her daughter. She didn't look at her parents. She stared straight ahead, jaw set, eyes unfocused, as if retreating inward were the only safe option left. Years collapsed into that moment. Every family gathering where Rachel had been subtly corrected. Every suggestion disguised as advice. Every raised eyebrow when we declined invitations that didn't suit us. Every time she'd been told she was too content. As if contentment were a symptom of laziness rather than peace. This wasn't about money. It was about permission. Permission they believed they had always owned. Thomas finally spoke again, his tone steady, almost conciliatory. He said this didn't have to be ugly. That they were offering a way forward with dignity. That the check was generous. That the agreement was fair. He said Rachel deserved to reclaim the life she'd set aside. As if our life had been a detour. As if the home we chose, the mornings we shared, the quiet rituals we built had been temporary accommodations instead of deliberate acts. I looked at Rachel then, really looked, and I saw the cost of years spent negotiating her place in a family that had never fully accepted her autonomy. I saw the exhaustion beneath her composure, the part of her that had learned to absorb judgment rather than challenge it. That was the moment the situation crossed a line it could never retreat from. Not because of the insult to me, but because they had spoken for Rachel without her consent. They had decided what she had lost, what she should want back, what version of herself was acceptable. They had reduced our life to a mistake and offered to fix it, without asking whether it was broken. I understood then that whatever happened next would not be about defending myself. It would be about restoring something they had no right to take. Rachel finally moved. She didn't speak. She reached for my hand. It was a small gesture, barely noticeable, but it was deliberate, and it told me everything I needed to know. The room seemed to sense the shift, though no one could name it. Thomas straightened slightly. Elaine's lips pressed together. Maya's eyes flicked toward us, uncertainty passing through her composure for the first time. They had expected fracture. What they hadn't accounted for was alignment. And for the first time that evening, I felt absolutely certain of what came next. I picked up the check. Not quickly, not with emphasis, just enough to acknowledge its existence. The paper was thick, textured, embossed with a bank name chosen for how it looked rather than how it worked. A number printed cleanly at the center, generous by ordinary standards, insulting by intention. I turned it once between my fingers, as if considering it. Then I set it back down. I asked for a moment. Not permission, just space. I didn't wait for agreement. I reached into my jacket and took out my phone. No rush, no visible tension. The kind of movement that doesn't ask for attention but inevitably receives it. Thomas shifted in his chair. Elaine's eyes narrowed slightly. Maya watched closely now, curiosity edging out certainty. I unlocked the phone and scrolled to a contact none of them recognized. When I placed the call on speaker, the room changed. Not instantly but perceptibly. People who are used to controlling environments notice when something they didn't anticipate enters the frame. The line connected on the second ring. I stated my name, gave a brief context, asked a single question. The voice that responded was calm, precise, familiar with my cadence. No greetings, no formalities, just confirmation. I asked for figures. They came back immediately. Not estimates, not projections. Ownership percentages, voting rights, contingencies tied to dormant clauses most people had forgotten existed. The words didn't rise in volume, but they carried weight. The kind of weight that shifts posture without announcing itself. Thomas leaned forward slightly, his attention no longer divided. Elaine stopped watching Rachel and looked directly at me. Maya's brow furrowed, not in confusion but calculation. I didn't look at any of them. I asked another question. The answer took longer this time. Not because it was uncertain, but because it was extensive. Layers, structures, time-stamped decisions stretching back years. Crisis-era entries. Capital that had stayed silent while others took credit for growth. As the details unfolded, the room lost its certainty. What had been framed as opinion was replaced by fact. What had been assumed as hierarchy was quietly redrawn. I wasn't posturing. I wasn't explaining. I wasn't revealing a dramatic secret. I was verifying reality. At some point, Thomas reached for his water glass and stopped halfway. His hand hovered there, suspended, before returning to the table empty. Elaine's composure tightened. She folded her hands carefully, as if restraint itself required effort. Maya's expression shifted last. Her confidence didn't vanish, it recalibrated. She began listening instead of judging. The difference was subtle but unmistakable. I ended the call without ceremony. Thanked the voice on the other end. Slipped the phone back into my jacket. No one spoke. The envelope still sat between us, unchanged. But it no longer meant what it had 10 minutes earlier. I didn't explain what had just happened. I didn't need to. Thomas finally cleared his throat, but the sound lacked its earlier authority. He asked carefully what exactly I was implying. I looked at him then, directly, calmly. I said I wasn't implying anything. I said I had simply confirmed my position. Silence stretched again, but this time it wasn't engineered. It was unsettled. The kind that follows when a narrative cracks and everyone hears it. Rachel squeezed my hand. Not tightly, just enough to ground herself. I felt the tension in her begin to shift, confusion giving way to something steadier. Not triumph, relief. Maya leaned back slightly, reassessing the table, the documents, the assumptions she had spoken with such confidence minutes earlier. Thomas glanced at the envelope. For the first time that night it looked small. What they didn't yet understand, but would soon, was that this wasn't a reversal driven by emotion or pride. It was simply the moment where their version of events stopped aligning with the truth. And once that happens, everything else follows. It took a few seconds for the room to remember how to breathe. Thomas Reed had spent his life surrounded by deference. By the time men reach his age with his level of wealth, silence usually bends toward them. That night it didn't. It held its ground. He asked where, exactly, my position sat. Not aggressively. Not dismissively. Precisely. That was the moment I knew the performance had ended. I didn't answer immediately. I reached for my coffee instead, took a slow sip, and set the cup down carefully, as if the table itself deserved respect. Rachel watched me now with a mixture of uncertainty and dawning clarity. She was seeing something she hadn't known existed. Not bravado, not retaliation, but preparation. I told them the controlling interest in Reed Industrial Holdings wasn't where they believed it was. Not in the visible family trust. Not in the executive shares Thomas referenced in interviews. Not even in the vehicles his advisors proudly cited when explaining the company's resilience during downturns. It was layered, deliberately. During the early expansion years, before the company carried its current name, capital had been needed quickly, quietly, without alarming lenders or diluting public confidence. Structures were built then, protective shells designed to weather storms no one wanted to admit were coming. Those shells were never dismantled. They were simply forgotten. I told them that during a crisis most people now referred to as temporary, I had stepped in. Not publicly, not ceremonially. I didn't want credit. I wanted stability. And stability requires patience more than visibility. I didn't say how much I'd invested. Numbers tend to distract people from structure. Instead, I described influence, voting thresholds, dormant clauses that activate only when certain conditions are met. Conditions that had quietly arrived months earlier. Elaine's expression changed first. She had always been sharper than she let on. She understood what it meant when someone spoke less about money and more about leverage. Maya leaned forward, elbows on the table now, her earlier certainty fully gone. She wasn't embarrassed. She was recalculating. That was something I respected even then. Thomas sat back slowly, the way men do when they realize they are no longer the tallest object in the room. I explained that every expansion he'd spoken about earlier, the acquisitions, the overseas facilities, the diversification he credited to instinct and timing, had traced back to one source. Not directionally, structurally. Me. Not because I sought control. Because control had been necessary. I wasn't revealing a secret. I was ending a performance. The check remained untouched. The envelope remained sealed. They now looked like artifacts from a previous misunderstanding. Rachel exhaled, a long breath she hadn't realized she was holding. I could feel the shift beside me. Not just relief, but the release of something heavier. Years of quiet doubt, of wondering whether the cost of our life together had been borne by her alone. Thomas asked why he hadn't known. I told him the truth. Because he'd never needed to. Because things had worked. Because I preferred it that way. Power doesn't need witnesses. It needs outcomes. That was the point where the dynamic corrected itself. Not dramatically, not publicly, but definitively. The way pressure equalizes when a hidden valve finally opens. Elaine asked what I wanted. The question surprised her as much as it surprised Rachel. I said I didn't want anything. Not money. Not acknowledgement. Not position. I wanted accuracy. I wanted the narrative adjusted to match reality. And I wanted the separation agreement withdrawn. Immediately. Not renegotiated. Not revised. Removed. Maya spoke then, carefully choosing her words. She asked if this meant Rachel and I intended to involve ourselves more directly in the company. I shook my head. I said that would depend on what happened next. That was when Thomas understood something crucial. This wasn't a threat. It was a boundary. For the first time that evening, he looked at Rachel. Not as someone who had drifted downward, but as someone who had stood inside a structure he'd never bothered to map. The room felt different now. Smaller. More honest. Rachel straightened her posture, not defensively, but naturally. The way people do when they realize they no longer need to make themselves fit. The envelope was quietly slid back toward Thomas. He didn't touch it. And in that stillness, with assumptions dismantled and certainty stripped down to fact, I knew the final phase had already begun. Not with confrontation, but with consequence. No one raised their voice after that. That was the strange part. The absence of escalation. The way tension didn't explode but instead compressed, folding inward on itself like a structure adjusting to a load it had miscalculated. Thomas was the first to break the stillness. Not with defiance, not with apology, but with procedure. He asked questions the way executives do when they realize emotion has lost its utility. Timelines, exposure, scope. He wanted to know how far this went, how much ground had shifted beneath him, and whether the floor would hold. I answered only what was necessary. I told him that certain actions, once initiated, don't announce themselves until they're finished. That ownership doesn't need to be loud to be decisive. And that some safeguards exist precisely because the people they protect against never believe they'll need them. Elaine asked about intent. Not mine, his. She wanted to know whether Thomas had planned to sell without full approval. The room tightened again. He didn't deny it. He framed it instead as positioning, as preparation, as moving quickly before the market shifted. He said it the way men do when they've said it to themselves often enough that it sounds reasonable. I didn't interrupt. I let the silence do the work. Because intent doesn't matter once documentation exists. And documentation had already surfaced. Not dramatically. Not slid across the table the way the envelope had been earlier. It arrived quietly, digitally, invisibly, triggered by thresholds Thomas hadn't realized he'd crossed. A planned sale without majority consent doesn't provoke outrage in rooms like this. Provokes inevitability. The conversation ended without ceremony. No accusations. No raised voices. No desperate bargaining. Just the slow recognition that certain paths were no longer available. The envelope lost its relevance. The check became meaningless paper. Not because of pride, but because the conditions that gave them power had been nullified. Maya sat very still, absorbing the consequences of assumptions she'd spoken aloud too confidently. She wasn't defensive anymore. She was thoughtful. I could see her replaying her words from earlier, recontextualizing them. That mattered to me more than apology ever could. Rachel hadn't spoken yet. Not once since Maya's comment. But I could feel her beside me. Present, grounded, no longer bracing for collapse. Her silence now wasn't endurance. It was choice. Thomas finally looked at her. Not as an extension of the family. Not as someone to be corrected. But as someone whose consent now mattered. He asked carefully what she wanted. Rachel took her time before answering. She didn't say she wanted more money. She didn't say she wanted acknowledgement. She said she wanted peace. She said she wanted her marriage left alone. She said she wanted the assumptions about her life to stop being discussed as if they were communal property. She said it evenly, without bitterness, without triumph. And in doing so, she reclaimed something far more valuable than leverage. The meeting ended the way it began, without affection, without warmth, but with something new layered beneath the surface. Respect. Not the performative kind, the reluctant kind, the kind that follows consequence. We stood. Chairs moved softly. The city lights outside had shifted again, clouds parting to reveal something cleaner, sharper. The house felt different now. Smaller, less imposing. No one asked us to stay. No one asked us to leave. So we left. Not abruptly. Not dramatically. We thanked them for dinner. We gathered our coats. We walked out the same glass doors we'd entered through hours earlier. The air outside was cool, thin, honest. As we drove away, Rachel reached for my hand. Not to steady herself this time, but to hold it. Neither of us spoke. There was nothing left to clarify. Behind us, decisions were already unfolding. Boards would convene. Advisors would recalibrate. Calls would be made to undo actions that could no longer be justified. The world they had built on assumption had corrected itself. Quietly, irreversibly. And for the first time that night, I felt something I hadn't expected. Not victory, relief, because the truth doesn't need to win. It just needs to be acknowledged. And once it is, everything else falls into place. We returned to the house Rachel and I chose years ago, the one that never tried to impress anyone. No gates, no view engineered to dominate the horizon. Just a place that fit us the way a well-worn coat fits a body that's lived inside it long enough to soften the seams. The lights were off when we arrived. We didn't turn them on right away. We stood in the quiet entryway, coats still on, the hum of the world fading behind us. For a long moment, neither of us moved. Then Rachel exhaled. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't relief the way movies portray it. It was the sound of something heavy finally being set down after years of carrying it without realizing how much it weighed. The days that followed were methodical. Board decisions didn't come with apologies. Leadership changes rarely do. They arrive disguised as restructures, advisory realignments, strategic transitions. Language smoothed sharp edges, softened accountability. It always does. Thomas didn't fight what was inevitable. To his credit, he didn't pretend nothing had happened either. He stepped back in increments, each one carefully justified, each one less visible than the last. The company moved on because it had been designed to do exactly that. Elaine called once. She didn't ask for forgiveness. She didn't attempt to reframe the past. She spoke instead about misunderstanding, about how families sometimes confuse proximity with permission. It was the closest she would come to admission. Rachel listened, thanked her for calling, ended the conversation when it no longer served its purpose. Maya reached out weeks later, not to debate, not to defend, to ask questions. She wanted to understand what she'd missed, how assumptions calcify, how people learn to speak with authority before earning it. Her message was careful, reflective. It didn't erase what she'd said, but it acknowledged its weight. Rachel replied on her own terms. Not immediately, not emotionally. She told her daughter that growth doesn't require shame, only awareness. That silence isn't always weakness, but it becomes dangerous when it replaces curiosity. And that love, real love, doesn't need to be validated by scale. Their relationship didn't reset. It recalibrated, and that was enough. As for me, I returned to the rhythm I'd always trusted. Quiet mornings. Work that mattered because it functioned, not because it impressed. Structures maintained. Risks measured. Outcomes secured. I didn't step into the spotlight. I never had the appetite for it. Influence works better when it doesn't announce itself. It leaves fewer fingerprints that way. What surprised me most wasn't how quickly things stabilized. It was how little I felt the need to explain. No one outside that room needed to know what had shifted. No one needed the story. The point hadn't been recognition. It had been correction. Rachel noticed the change first. She slept better. Not longer, deeper. Her shoulders no longer carried that subtle tension that comes from being evaluated by invisible standards. She laughed more easily. Not louder. Freer. We cooked together again, unhurried. Ate at the counter. Walked in the evenings without destination. The life we'd built resumed, not as a retreat, but as a confirmation. One night, weeks later, she asked me why I'd never told her. Not accusingly. Genuinely. I told her the truth. Because I never wanted power to become the reason we were together. Because I didn't want her loyalty to be confused with security. Because I needed to know that what we shared existed without leverage. She listened quietly. Then she said something I hadn't expected. She said she was glad. Glad she'd chosen me without knowing. Glad our life had been real before it had been defended. Glad that when the world tried to measure us, we hadn't rushed to prove anything. That night, the silence between us felt different than it ever had. Not like endurance, like peace. Some people think justice arrives with spectacle, with raised voices and final words that echo. They're wrong. Real justice is quieter than that. It's the restoration of balance. The removal of weight that never should have been carried. The moment when a life returns to its rightful scale. I didn't walk away with triumph. I walked away with alignment. And in the end, that mattered more than anything they tried to take. Because nothing they believed was real anymore. And everything that mattered still was.